Well, good morning, everyone. It's so good to be back. Sandy and I enjoy coming out to you guys. We enjoy it when the snow plows have done their job, though we almost got taken out by a snow plow this morning. We were on Highway 28, and the snow plow was at the side there, and he decided he wanted to do a U-turn on the highway, and for some reason didn't see us initially. Fortunately, God intervened and said, "Idiot! Stop. I got to get this guy to the church on time." So here we are. Wonderful to hear all the prayer requests. Like this morning, there were a lot of prayer requests. And I think it sort of dovetails with what we're all about right this morning. We're in this series about Jesus' parables. Parables are stories. And don't you just love stories? And what is the idea behind making prayer requests? It's that, hey, I or someone I love and care about has a story, and we bring it before God, expecting then for Him to enter that story, to be in that story, to change it for the good. And this morning we're going to be talking about this one girl's story quite extensively. And then I'm going to get to the scriptures. But we're going to go and spend a fair bit of time in the story of this one girl. And I wonder if, you know how in Revelation, it talks about before the throne of God, there's going to be people from every tongue and tribe and nation. And I think that's got to be that every type of people group on earth has their own story of how God has intervened in their lives. How God has come to them and blessed them and changed a bad situation into a good situation. And I wonder if there's angels in heaven that do the tallying. You know, maybe there's, you know how the earth, they say, is so fine-tuned for life to exist here. There's all these mathematical equations for life to exist here. This element had to be this way, and this equation had to be this way. I wonder if there's accountant angels, then maybe they're at 6,999,999,000,000, so on and so on, and they're just waiting for that last story of God's grace to hit 7 trillion, and then the Lord comes back. You know, who knows? There's got to be all of these things that sort of come together, and but I think what you and I will be sharing in eternity is endless campfire gatherings saying, do you remember that time when Jesus came and this happened? I think we're all going to have those tales. Well, that's where we're going to go today. We're going to end up in Luke chapter 15. And that's where Jesus tells 3 stories about the same thing. Something precious that was lost and perhaps thought it was forgotten, in the dark, by itself, isolated, never to be recovered again. But Jesus says God knew and God cared and God recovered the thing that was lost. When we go to communion afterwards, it's basically the same thing. We're going to be celebrating the actual true story of Jesus going to the cross to die for us so that we could be gathered in to His story. And we're affirming that every time we take communion. That, Lord, what happened to you, your tale, was for us. And we have a little paragraph in the grand drama of redemption. So let's go to this story about a girl who actually ended up in my neck of the woods. Scarborough, Ontario is where I grew up. It was a borough of Toronto in the East End. That's where I grew up. Do you know that in Scarborough, Ontario, Scarborough, Toronto, I played Risk once with Mike Myers, the voice of Shrek. Yes, I did. In grade 9, we were in the same high school. My best friend was Eric McCormick. If you know Will and Grace, he played Will. I went to his wedding. Sandy and I went to his wedding in Vancouver. But this girl I never met, but she came to Scarborough, Ontario from Southeast Asia. And I think you're going to know of her eventually, but I'm going to leave her identity a little bit hidden to begin with. So, she was number 6 in her South Asian family, and her 2-syllable name, if you translated it into English, meant golden happiness. Nice name for a child, eh? That's a hopeful name, golden happiness. And as a child, she was very happy. Her mother, however, often simply addressed her little girl as Mai, which meant beautiful. Nice monikers, golden happiness and beautiful. Well, as a young girl in a tropical village surrounded by family, little Mai enjoyed climbing the guava trees and feasting on the juicy fruit. Sometimes she would take a book with her and hide there amongst the leaves and read contentedly on those hot Southeast Asian days. And her father below her would take care of the farm. They didn't have lambs, but they had piglets. They had piglets running everywhere, as well as chickens and ducks and swans, she says, as well as the family pets of dogs and cats. And when both mother and father were occupied with their jobs, because mother ran a successful restaurant in a nearby town with her noodles, she made this wonderful noodle soup, apparently. So when they were gone, she had a great uncle who would look after them because it was a big family. Great uncle would come over, and because it would get hot in the afternoon, in the compound he had a hammock, and he would often fall asleep. And Mai and her brother and her friend Han, they sometimes would play tricks on Great Uncle. One of the tricks they liked to do was when Great Uncle got into snoring away with his mouth open, they would get a spoonful of salt and they would pour it into his mouth. And he'd wake up and go, Mai! Sometimes they would get some cold spring water in a tube, and if he took off his shirt because he was so hot, they would pour it into his belly button. So she was a bit of a prankster. She had a fun-loving spirit. Well, another feature of Golden Happiness's childhood was that her family was very involved at this local temple that was just walking distance away. They practiced a religion called Khao Dai. It was a syncretistic religion that believed all faiths were equally true as a way of getting to God. In her memoir, she says that you might say that we were equal opportunity worshipers, giving any and every God a shot. And so Yahweh, Allah, Jesus, Buddha, they were all accepted, all the different Eastern gods as well from Japan and China. And even, curiously enough, the French writer Victor Hugo was part of that pantheon of gods. So she said, let's see, their mantra was, you are God and God is in you. So that kind of pantheistic thing, that God is everywhere, including you. So there was a heavy emphasis on purification and devotion to realize this. And this was something that Mai gravitated to. She was naturally a very religious person, more than her siblings. And she took it very seriously because she had an ardent heart and she aspired to be very close to the gods. Her story, however, is one of losing that closeness to the gods and losing her home, losing her country as she once knew it, and losing so much more before finding much more. Hers is a tale of wandering down a darkened path of pain in deep isolation after the bitter loss of both her own happiness and her own beauty. She was named Golden Happiness. She was called Mai, beautiful one. But she would lose both of those. She would lose the innocence of childhood and the terrible conflict that was raging in her country. But it was a journey that because of the grace of God, one day she would recover both in a way that she never could have imagined. And it's a story that's inspired people all around the world. This little village girl has become an international figure. Well, all during Mai's childhood, she was vaguely aware that there was a conflict going on in her country, a civil war, but until she was about 9, it seemed quite remote and inconsequential. But in her 9th year, the forest people, as she called them, these dark-clad, secretive people who often appeared only at night to look for food and tools, leaving their distinctive car tire-soled sandal prints in the mud, they began to show up much more frequently. Something was afoot. Well, tunnels started to be dug around and under their property. And these people became quite threatening. And they said those who don't assist them, they were going to be treated badly, some even killed. So soldiers from the southern capital began to patrol too, and the sound of bombs and gunfire began to encroach. One day at her mother's restaurant, a terrible thing happened. A suicide bomber came, and they basically destroyed this whole wedding party that had gone there to celebrate their wedding. Her mother not only saw this, but was mistakenly implicated that she was somehow involved in this. And for 1 month, Mai lost her mother to a prison. She was there until finally her name was cleared. So her pleasant little childhood world was coming to the end as the storm clouds of war gathered around. Well, one week, some international journalists appeared in their village, along with more soldiers. Everyone sensed that something was about to happen. Mai and her family had been living in the temple at this time because living at their home became too dangerous. They were fairly well-to-do as farmers, which meant they were frequently targeted by the forest people for more and more food. So, with their home unsafe, they sought the security that they thought the temple would provide, but it proved to be inadequate. Suddenly, a plane swooped out of the sky one day and dropped a colored smoke bomb signal. Was it a mistake? Had they thought that the communists from the north had taken this position? Because it was one of their own planes. Well, the South Vietnamese soldiers, because this is a story about Vietnam, they started shouting for everyone to run. They knew that the signal was for the bombers who were about to fly by. Mai and the family members that were with her, including a toddler nephew that she'd been playing with, all began to run down the road when suddenly an American military plane roared by, dropping 3 sets of double bombs containing napalm, that horrible American invention of sticky, incendiary chemical that burned at a staggering, how much do you set your oven at the most if you're going to cook something? 500. This napalm burned at 5,000 degrees. It was the death of a number of innocent people that day, but for 9-year-old Mai, it propelled her into the international spotlight, a poster child for the wretched Vietnam War, as she ran down the road screaming in her pain, her clothes all burnt off, parts of her flesh melted, as she screamed, "Nong Quai, Nong Quai," meaning too hot, too hot. This is her book, Fire Road. We'll go to the next slide. I haven't really been paying attention. Sorry, Mark. That's just a picture of Vietnam that I found on the internet. We'll go to the next one. Then, of course, here's the war. And maybe the next, her book, Fire Road. Okay. So, a BBC journalist was there, as well as the one who took this famous photograph from, who ended up, a Cambodian guy, I think, who ended up in the States. But the BBC journalist saw Mai in her terrible pain, and he had a canteen of water, and he poured some down her throat. And then, seeing that she was burnt, thinking that it would help her, he actually poured some water on her body, but it actually caused a chemical reaction with the napalm, and she burst into flames again. And the agony was such that she fell to the ground in a dead faint. Well, those same journalists gathered her up in their arms, put her in a vehicle, and took her to the nearest town, to the hospital there. But the hospital staff just shook their heads and said, her injuries are too grave. We can't deal with that here. Take her to Saigon. So she was transported to Saigon, where the doctors looked at her, but her parents didn't know. They didn't know what was happening. It took them 3 days to catch up to their little girl. And when they got there, they had a horrible experience. They couldn't find their little girl until somebody, an orderly, directed them to the morgue. Mai had been placed in the morgue, still alive, because the doctors thought, she's a goner. We can't do anything for this poor girl. So for 3 days, she was in a coma in there, but her little nephew, the 3-year-old, was also in the morgue, and he had died. And she began to hear the voices of her parents lamenting over the death of this little boy. And that triggered her consciousness. She woke up and she called out to them, and they found her. They found their girl amongst all of those bodies there. So the next years were very difficult. Well, let me just say one thing that happened that was very providential. Mai's father ran to get a surgeon. The surgeon looked at him and recognized him. Apparently, they'd gone to university together 20 years before. And because of that connection, as you can imagine, there were so many wounded people in the hospital those days, so many soldiers, so many civilians, that he gave the father special attention, said, okay, look, I'm going to do everything I can to get your little girl better. And an American doctor had set up a special burn unit not too far away in another facility, and Mai was given the privilege of going there, where they were able to do a number of skin grafts and just get her through that initial trauma so that she could survive. But survival was one thing. Living with being burnt on her arm, her shoulder, and her back, disfigured and in constant pain, as this skin had turned all tough like hide, and she couldn't have any more sweat glands there, and she's living in a tropical country, and it was itchy all the time. And so when she finally, months and months later, was reintroduced to her village, feeling so relieved to be out of the hospital, one of the first things that happened was she met her best friend, and her best friend saw her scars and disfigurement and turned away. She rejected her. She couldn't deal with the transformation that had happened in her friend. And so little Mai was sort of a burden on the family. She couldn't do half the things that she once did, and they had to scratch her skin for her, they had to feed her. And one uncle came over one day and said, it would have been better for her to have died. And he said that in her presence. And she just felt this great ache in her being. She'd always loved the thought of one day growing up and being married and having children of her own. And now that dream seemed to be very distant. She tried to find more meaning in her religion, Kaudai, and she attended the 4 daily times of prayer. And she began to nurse this thought of, maybe I can be a doctor one day and help children. Maybe I could become a pediatrician. And she was a bright girl, and so she sort of set her hopes on that. But psychologically, she was struggling. She writes this in her book on page 56. She says, I made an agreement in those moments when the napalm scorched my clothing, and then my skin, and then the fat and muscle and other tissue that had once thrived in layers below, that because I would now and forever be seen as different, I was unfit to be loved. My pale, beautiful skin was now appalling, mushy, and bumpy and red. I am unfit to be loved. My long, glossy hair, which once cascaded halfway down my back, was now a crunchy, uneven bob. I am unfit to be loved. I no longer looked anything like the other girls. I am unfit to be loved. I would never be normal or acceptable. I am unfit to be loved. Well, years went by. At 1979, at 16 years of age, having gone to high school in another town, living with her sister, I think it was, she desperately tried, like so many other Vietnamese at that time, to escape her troubled country by boarding a boat and sailing off into the sea, hoping for international intervention, that someone would rescue them. 3 times she paid some money, she went down to the beach, and she tried to get out to a boat, 3 times her efforts were thwarted, so that she finally gave up. She felt she could not escape, she could not start over. And her faith in those Kaudai gods, none of whom she knew personally, was also under strain. 3 more years went by, and at 19, she was able to enter university. She began to think, okay, at least I can salvage something for my life, do something meaningful. If I become a pediatrician, I can help others who know pain and suffering like I do. But it had also been 10 years since the napalm attack and her awful scarring, and that anniversary elicited some global curiosity. Whatever happened to the napalm girl? How was she doing? So all of these journalists began contacting the communist government in Vietnam, requesting permission to interview her and take some photographs. And that alerted the local government to the fact that they had something valuable here. They had a potential tool for their propaganda campaigns. So they sought out little Mai. Well, now she's older, she's 19, so they found her, and they began at various times to simply pluck her out of her university classes and say, we have a job for you to do. There's some journalists here. You answer their questions, we have a translator, and then you can go back to school. Well, what happened, of course, was they didn't translate what she said. They just inserted their own words to say how much she hated the Americans, how much she loved her own country. They distorted everything. And over the next few years, Kim Phuc became a puppet of this ruthless regime that cared nothing for her as a person, but found that she was a helpful voice in attacking their enemies. Well, after a while, she couldn't keep up with her studies, and then the authorities put pressure on the university itself to expel her. At that point, everything looked bleak. Golden Happiness began to contemplate jumping into the busy traffic in her city and to end her life, because really, what future did she have? Well, I don't know if you're aware of her story. Because her story is well worth investigating, I hope you would look at her up, but we have to soon turn to the scriptures. I want to briefly jump ahead to what became of this troubled and traumatized teenager, and then to make the point of how her transformation was possible. After something wonderful happened in her life, she became like a daughter to the Prime Minister of Vietnam, who personally intervened with her handlers to say, look, you can't be doing this to her anymore. He made it possible for her to go to another communist country to continue her studies in Cuba. In Cuba, the Lord answered her prayers. She met a Vietnamese man also studying there, and she got married. She was given permission to marry this fellow, and then they were given permission to go on a honeymoon to beautiful, wonderful Moscow. Everyone's dream destination. But you know what happened? When they were coming back, they stopped in Gander, Newfoundland to refuel. And on an impulse, they defected. They jumped plane, and Canada embraced them. The Lord raised up people in Canada who were very sympathetic to their plight, and they began to make a home in Scarborough, Ontario, and she realized her dream of becoming a mother. She had 2 boys. And since that time, she's become a spokesperson for peace, for forgiveness, and for the Christian faith all around the world. She's spoken at the UN. She's won numerous awards. She has become a symbol of hope, where once she was a symbol of terror and pain. How did that happen? How could that possibly have happened? Jesus. So, 2 things. First, the terror of the war and her own personal scarring were captured in a compelling photograph, the photograph on the cover of this book. It was published worldwide and became an emblem of the anguish of war and its cost. There were all sorts of journalists there in Vietnam. There were all sorts of pictures taken, but it was that child in anguish, stripped of everything, in pain, that just tugged the heartstrings of people in America, in Canada, in Europe, and elsewhere. She became an emblem of that anguish and the brutal machinery of conflict. If that was the end of the story, it would only be a tragic and pitiful tale of lost innocence, happiness, and beauty. But by God's grace, Kim Phuc's story became transformative and redemptive for anyone with ears to hear. Because instead of giving in to despair, one day, to escape her handlers, the government people that would take her off to these interviews, she went to hide in the main library of the town. And there she went to the religious section of the library. And she realized, here I am in this religion, Cao Dai, honoring and worshiping all of these different gods, but I really don't know anything about these gods. And so she began to read these different books about these religions, including a New Testament. And she discovered that what she knew about Jesus was actually very little, and that the portrait the Gospels painted began to haunt her. In her own words, she says this: "An hour later, I had picked my way through the Gospels, logging question after question in my mind, fearing that if I wrote them down on paper, I would surely be found out by the communists, right? They're atheists. I wound up in the book of John. That's where we were for a number of months. And at least two themes have become abundantly clear. First, despite all that I'd learned through Cao Dai, that there were many gods, that there were many paths to holiness, that so much of my success in religion rested atop my own weary, slumped shoulders, Jesus presented himself as the way, the truth, and the life. His entire ministry, it seemed, pointed to one straightforward claim: I am the way you get to God. There is no other way but me. Well, at this assertion, I reflexively shook my head. What? I said to myself, how can this be so? There are thousands of ways to get to God. Everyone knows this. What a brash position Jesus has taken, that of being the only way. My hands were trembling as I shut the book at once, overcome by confusion and fear. If it was accurate that this Jesus was uniquely able to connect me to God, to truth, to nothing short of life, then I had spent 19 years worshiping the wrong gods, devoting myself fully to a cause that could never soothe the ache I felt deep in my soul. What was I to do now? Good question when we come up against the claims of Jesus, because Jesus demands an answer. Well, the question that lingered in my mind as I considered the second of two themes, this question lingered in my mind as I considered the second of two themes I'd found. This Jesus, he had suffered in my defense of his claim. He had been mocked and tortured and killed. Why would he do these things, I wondered, if he were not, in fact, God? His pain must have been for a purpose, I reasoned, or else he could not have so faithfully endured the strife. I'd never been exposed to this side of Jesus, the wounded one, the one who bore scars. In Cao Dai, Jesus was presented as one of a whole host of prophets. A good man, yes, but certainly not a man who was God. I turned over this new information in my mind as a gem in my hand, relishing the light that was cast from all sides. If this Jesus was indeed who he said he was, and if he had truly endured all he said that he had endured, then perhaps he could help me make sense of my pain and at last come to terms with my scars. With these seeds planted in her, two other things happened to draw her into faith. One was that this other nephew in her household, where she was staying with her sister, needed an operation. And her nephew's father, her brother-in-law, who had died in the war, he'd once known a pastor. And that pastor came over to visit for 2 weeks to pray for this nephew. And he invited Mai's questions, because she had lots of questions from reading the Gospels. And he graciously entered into conversation with her and then invited her to come and attend his church. And she went, and she thought, this is so different from my religion. There's such a freedom here, and it's not so regimented. And she saw people experiencing real joy. But she was still in pain physically and emotionally. And so she records a crisis moment in her book a few weeks later. She's begun exploring about Jesus, but the devil doesn't want her to easily enter into this. She needed more than a placebo. She really needed God's saving hand. So she says this, across those weeks, the pressure mounted, both from outside forces and from within. And eventually I found myself at the precipice of despair. Everything in me shouted, no more. I had to find a way out. A person could not live like this, abused, forsaken, and alone. On the wooden bench in my sister's backyard, I looked skyward. I stared at the blueness of the sky, so bright it almost appeared white, and I shook my head over the futility of it all. What good is this beautiful day when my life is this ugly and bleak? I began to sob uncontrollably, and then I began to yell uncontrollably. God, where are you? Do you even exist at all? Why am I made to suffer like this? Why will you not come to my aid? I wept until I was spent, until I had no more tears to cry, until I expended every last burst of energy, until I was weak and quiet and still. It was then that I made a deal with God. If you will just give me a friend, I said to the heavens, just one person who knows you and who can help me know you, then I will agree not to take my life. Well, the next day was Sunday, and Mai arrived early, and sitting alone in the middle of the church was a woman a few years older than her. Mai went up to her and began talking. And a relationship was born, one that could only be pursued on Sundays, otherwise the communist authorities that kept watch over her would have caused serious trouble. But after several months, on Christmas Eve of all things, an altar call was presented at the church, and the pastor said this, if anyone sitting here today shall open his or her heart to this Jesus, then Jesus will come to you and bring you peace and remove all burdens from your life. Well, Kim Fook, Golden Happiness, writes of her response, I nearly jumped out of my seat then and there. How desperately I needed peace. How ready I was for love and joy. I have so much hatred in my heart, I thought. This burden of bitterness is too heavy to bear. I wanted forgiveness for my transgressions. I wanted to let go of all my pain. I wanted to pursue life instead of holding fast to fantasies of death. I wanted this Jesus. Well, that evening, the balm of Gilead gathered up the napalm girl of Vietnam, and something new and good and kind and powerful entered her life, the start of something very happy, even joyful, and the beauty of becoming a daughter of the King. I'm going to read to you 3 stories that Jesus told that most of you, I think, would find very familiar. And so we don't need to explain them at all. Mai's story is the explanation. It's the illustration. Now all the tax collectors and outsiders were crowding around to hear what Jesus had to say. And the Pharisees and the scribes complained of this, remarking, this man accepts sinners and even eats his meals with them. So Jesus spoke to them using this parable. Wouldn't any man among you who owned 100 sheep and lost one of them leave the 99 to themselves in the open and go after the one which is lost until he finds it? And when he has found it, he will put it on his shoulders with great joy, and as soon as he gets home, he will call his friends and neighbors together. Come, celebrate with me. I have found that sheep of mine which was lost. I tell you, it is the same in heaven. There is more joy over one sinner whose heart is changed than over 99 righteous people who have no need for repentance. Or if there is a woman who has 10 silver coins, if she should lose one, won't she take a lamp and sweep and search the house from top to bottom until she finds it? And when she's found it, she calls her friends and neighbors together. Come and celebrate with me, she says, for I have found that coin I lost. I tell you, it is the same in heaven. There's rejoicing among the angels of God over one sinner whose heart is changed. Then he continued, once there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, Father, give me my share of the property that will come to me. So he divided up his property between the 2 of them. And before very long, the younger son collected all his belongings and went off to a foreign land, where he squandered his wealth in the wildest extravagance. And when he'd run through all his money, a terrible famine arose in that country, and he began to feel the pinch. Then he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him out into the fields to feed the pigs. He got to the point of longing to stuff himself with the food the pigs were eating, and not a soul gave him anything. Then he came to his senses, and he cried aloud, Why, dozens of my father's hired men have got more food than they can eat, and here I am dying of hunger. I will get up and go back to my father, and I'll say to him, Father, I've done wrong in the sight of heaven and in your eyes. I don't deserve to be called your son anymore. Please take me on as one of your hired men. So he got up, and he went to his father. But while he was still some distance off, his father saw him, and his heart went out to him. And he ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. But his son said, Father, I've done wrong in the sight of heaven and in your eyes. I don't deserve to be called your son anymore. Hurry, called out his father to the servants. Fetch the best clothes and put them on him. Put a ring on his finger and shoes on his feet, and get that calf we fattened and kill it. We'll have a feast and a celebration tonight. For this, my son, I thought he was dead, and he's alive again. I thought I'd lost him, and he is found. And they began to get the festivities going. Does anything else need to be said? How beautiful are the stories of God's grace. How beautiful it is, in the end, to be lost, to be alone, to be in pain, to be in despair, if you are found by God. It's the preparation for the festivity. He doesn't want you to stay in that place. He wants to rescue you. And that's what this communion service is about enjoying being rescued, enjoying being part of the family of God, and just being in awe that someone so unworthy could have the hope of eternity in a pure environment of love and acceptance forever and ever. Well, we're going to pass out those elements, but before we do, this is when my wife needs to pray for me. There's a song that I have loved for, years and years. And it's by a man called John Michael Talbot. That was Kim Fook afterwards. And just to see the joy on her face, just how things just utterly changed for her. Do you know, though, initially it was tough. Her mother, who was very high up in Kaudai, she rejected her for a number of years. But eventually, God opened the way for her mother and her father to leave Vietnam and to come to Canada and to live with them. He brought about reconciliation. But this song is called I Am the Bread of Life. And it's slightly off tune. Oh well. It's good to sing things off tune to the one who puts us all in harmony with his will, isn't it? I am the bread of life. bread will never die. I am God's love revealed. I am broken that you might be healed. All who eat of this heavenly bread, all who drink this cup of the covenant, you will live forever. For I will raise you up. I am the bread of life. All who eat this bread will never die. No one who comes to me shall hunger again. No one who believes shall ever thirst. All that the Father draws shall come to me, and I shall give them rest. I am the bread of life. All who eat this bread will never die. I am God's love revealed. I am broken that you might be healed. I am broken that you might be healed. What does Jesus say? In 1 Corinthians, Paul says, "For as often as you eat this bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." I mean, we know that when he comes, he says, in the new order, there will be no more pain. There'll be no more death. There'll be no more crying. God didn't make us to live an existence of pain. He has come to be our healer. In 1 Corinthians 10:16, it says, "The cup of blessing that we bless, is it not a participation in the blood of Christ? The bread that we break, is it not a participation in the body of Christ?" So the way through, as Mai discovered, is Jesus. He is the way, the truth, and the life. And so he invites us now to come to him. And as you peel back that upper layer, you'll find a little wafer. And if you put your trust in Jesus, this represents his body broken on the cross, which we now will take as I just pray, and then take this and we'll open up the second portion, which represents his blood. So Jesus, thank you for being God's vehicle of grace, that as scarred as we might be, as broken as we might be, we too can experience recovery and regeneration. We do this in remembrance of the cross and how you made this possible through your own death. Please take and eat. And the scripture says, without the shedding of blood, there's no forgiveness of sins. And Jesus knew that he was the Lamb of God who come to take away the sins of the world. And so he also invited his followers to partake of that cup. Just as the ancient Israelites had put blood on the day of the Passover and their freedom from Egypt and slavery by putting it over the lintel of the door frame, Jesus continued that tradition, saying, look, my blood is now going to purchase your ultimate freedom. So we'll pray for this and then we'll take this together. Lord, we thank you again for your sacrifice, as undeserving as we are, that you wanted to have a family. You wanted people to see your glory. You wanted to defeat the evil one in our lives. And you wanted us to share in life eternal at your banquet table. So we take this now in faith. Amen.